Let's begin our discussion for this evening, bi'awnillahi ta'ala. We are now at the mistakes of the sujood. Now, the first primary mistake when it comes to the sujood is very, very important. It's the most common mistake. It's the one mistake that most people who have problems with the sujood, they're going to have problems in this area. And that is, the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to have 7 parts of our body touch the ground and be firm into the ground when we go into the sujood. Now, this problem here with this mistake is, for some musallin, for some of the people who pray, they don't have all 7 parts actually touching the ground. And we've talked about this before. Now, the Prophet ﷺ mentions these 7 parts, we all know what they are. They include the nose. Now, with the nose, some of the ulama have a difference of opinion, believe it or not, what is exactly a nose? Because what they say is the nose, it has a particular bone or a joint area, and some ulama have a khilaf of whether this part of the nose and the forehead actually counts as 1 or 2 separate parts. And why do I say that? Just imagine if you're going into sujood, and when your nose is onto the ground, some of the ulama encourage to try to get this inner part of between the forehead and the nose to try to touch this to the ground. And the reason why is even the Prophet ﷺ mentions that the athar of sujood is also found here in this place. It's not just in the forehead. You know, some people have that dark spot on their forehead. The Prophet ﷺ talked about this and mentioned that this spot here, if it was done and it was brought to that person and they're given this sujood mark, then insha'Allah ta'ala, Allah will cause that spot to be brighter than the sun on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So some of the ulama said to achieve this, one of the ways is to perfect the face when it touches the ground for sujood, and part of doing that is to try to get this area to also touch the ground. Now let me tell you, that's not easy. It's very difficult. As a matter of fact, you might even find yourself pushing, literally forcing your head into the ground. Now you don't want to force your head into the ground, but just apply some pressure that is comfortable at the same time. That's number 1. Then the 2 is the hands. Then 3 is the knees. So what are we at here? We are at 5. And then 6, 7 is the 2 feet. All 7 of these parts of the body have to be firmly placed into the ground. Now there's a couple of issues here. The first issue is, how do you perform a perfect sujood? Now when a person performs a perfect sujood, from the mistakes, this is the second mistake of the sujood, is when people go into sujood, their hands are placed to the ground, but their fingers are spread apart. The Prophet ﷺ sunnah of going into sujood is hands or fingers are together. And the reason, the hikmah behind this, of course, is all the fingers face and point towards the qibla. Secondly is the palm area. The palm area is extremely important also for it to be firmly placed into the ground. Don't just have your fingers like this and just have them resting on the ground lightly. Try to keep your entire palm into the ground as well. When it comes to the hand, the third mistake when it comes to the sujood and placing the hands is the arms touching the ground. The Prophet ﷺ made a tashbih and said that this here, when you do that, it's like the sitting of the dog. When the dog wants to relax, what does it do? It takes its 2 front paws and lays it down into the ground. And does the same thing with its back legs as well. The Prophet ﷺ says, don't imitate the animals like this when it comes into the sujood. Even Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah tells us that a person who imitates any animal in their sujood, فَقَدْ أَبْطَلَ الصَّلَاةِ, then verily their salah is broken. So you have to be very careful of how the sujood looks. Even some of the ulama said, don't make your sujood resemble like the curls of the snake. What does that mean? Some people, when they go into sujood, their nature in sujood is that their body is, how can I say this? It's not consistent. In other words, their body looks very messy when they're in the sujood. So you'll have like one of their feet pointing this way, another feet pointing that way. One hand is straight, the other hand is probably this. It's just a lot of careless little detail that they miss out with the sujood. And scholars, they say this is very similar to how a snake will sit and relax itself. That a snake will start to curl itself, but its head would probably popping out, its tail would pop out this way, and all of these different features about them. So it's a very, very intricate detail about the sujood you try to perfect as well and avoid. When it comes to the feet and the knees, I don't know until this day why some Muslims, they do this. But some Muslims, and I'm sure some of us here, we've probably seen this, that some Muslims, when they go into the sujood, they'll raise their feet off the ground. I don't know what that's for. I don't know if they're just airing their toes or what it is, but they'll just raise their feet off the ground. I've even seen like people who play with their feet at the same time. You know, I've even seen some people scratching their feet. They use one feet and scratch the other feet and do all of that while you're in sujood. Remember, brothers and sisters, that being in sujood, you're the closest to Allah Azza wa Jal. Imagine if you are the closest to your Rabb, and this is the nature you meet Him in. It's really, really a very, very careless manner to be in front of Allah Azza wa Jal in this particular state. And this is why I've always said that people today, especially in Salah, do a lot of crazy things. A lot of things that were unheard of. I mean, sometimes when I try to research some of the things that I've seen people do, I can't find them in any of the old books. I have to look for them in more of the newer books that scholars have written, because these things were simply not understood or they weren't aware of back in the day. So that's important, is that we try to keep our feet firmly into the ground. When it comes to the toes should also be bent in such a way that you try to do this to the best of your ability, that your toes are facing towards the Qibla as best as possible. Next mistake is when the feet are down, you want to try to keep the feet touching each other as best as you can. So the heels, so imagine this is the feet. You want the heels to be able to touch each other as best as you can. And this is something that also the Prophet ﷺ, it was narrated by some of the companions that they used to witness this from him. That every time he would go into the sujood, he would be together with his feet. Next point is, after all of these limbs and these parts of the body touch the ground, now we want to look at exactly the position of how the sujood should look. And this is extremely important, and I need somebody to volunteer this for me. So, who can I pick on? How about you? You're by yourself there, man. Come, let me single you out and bring you. Okay? Now, I need the sisters to look at this. Can you get the Yusuf to come and just control the camera? Okay. So we want to look at how a sujood is supposed to look. I'd get you to go on the table, but I'm afraid for you, okay? In the meantime, let's set you up. So let's get you to go into a sujood. And you can face this way, okay? But don't make no niyyah for any salah or anything, or else you're in trouble, okay? Okay, so look what's happened here. Now the first thing when it comes to the sujood, okay, let's just wait for a moment. Okay, you can come out. You can come out. Okay, you can sit. You can sit. Let's just wait until the brother comes so that we can get the sisters to be able to see this. But basically what I want to do is I want to demonstrate how the sujood should look once everything is complete. There should be a perfect manner and a perfect structure in how the sujood should look. This here, you stay right there, okay? This here, what we're going to demonstrate is how, inshallah, you want your sujood to look from this point forward. Every single time. It doesn't matter if it's a nafil or a sunnah prayer or a fard prayer, it doesn't matter. You want to try to make sure that every single moment now from this point forward, try to perfect your sujood this way as best as possible. We're going to talk about also the arms and how to space them out, because the Prophet ﷺ also mentions that as well in another hadith. So, in the meantime, when we're waiting for this brother, you stay right there, okay? In the meantime, when we're waiting for them, another mistake that we want to take is giving a platform to an elderly or weak or sick person to perform sujood on. I've seen this happen before. You know what happens is that some people, they'll see like an old man who can't go down for sujood, but he can stand and he can sit and he can do the ruku' and everything else. But when it comes down to the sujood, it's as if at some point he's either afraid or doesn't want to put in 100% effort in going to the sujood. So what did some people do? They'll take like a piece of wood or a small table or a small stool, and they'll place it in front of him where he would perform sujood on that stool. So that way it prevents him from taking his entire body to the ground. This happened to a companion who was very sick. And Abdullah ibn Umar and the Prophet ﷺ, they both went to visit this man when he was sick. When the Prophet ﷺ and Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, they walked in, they saw this man performing sujood on a piece of wood. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered Abdullah ibn Umar to remove that piece of wood. And when the man was finished, he told the man this. He says, if you can perform the sujood in its entirety, then you must do that. وَإِلَّا, but if you can't, then you can use something to support you, or sit, do the three ways. You either you either pray standing, pray sitting, or pray lying down. The three main categories or methods of how to pray. Let's go back to the sujood really quickly. Okay, so let's go into sujood now. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. So the first thing that you want to look at is, let's get you to straighten up, is the space here, is the space between his leg and his stomach. This here, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that when you perform this kind of sujood, you want to make sure that there is a gap between your leg and your stomach. And it should be almost to a 90-degree angle. You're going to probably need some assistance with somebody to tell you exactly how this should look. So obviously his is too much back, so pull this forward a little bit. Perfect. The second thing is, so that's the first part. The second thing is the straightness of his back. You want his back to be as straight as possible. So flex your back or look strong, look like you're firm. Very good. Third thing. Remember we talked about the feet? So this is how the feet should look. So you want to point your toes, and then the heels will touch each other as best as you can. The heels will touch each other as best as you can. Next point is the arms. Now, scholars, they differ on where the hand should be. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, he mentions that the hands, it should line up with the ears. It should line up with the ears here. Other scholars said no. Other scholars said that the hands should be as far back to your shoulders as much as possible. And this here is the jumhur. The majority of madhahib tell us that this here, this is including Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad, Imam Abu Hanifa, that your hands should be lined up or squared off with the shoulder area. This here is not a major concern in the salah, either or, insha'Allah, is also valid. Next point here is, now we can take this as the next mistake. The next mistake when it comes to the sujood is that people are closing in their arms and making themselves very tightly. Now this here, this type of sifa or description of the sujood is only for the women. The women are ordered to keep their bodies together as best as they can. This is one of the 5 ways of how a woman's prayer is different from a man's prayer. So one way is that when she goes down for sujood, her body is close together as much as possible. Some ulama also mentioned that if it was just women alone, then she's allowed to pray the same way that I've mentioned here. She's allowed to pray like how exactly the Prophet ﷺ and all the other companions would pray. But otherwise, especially she's in a jama'ah or anywhere else, she should keep her body close together as much as possible. Are you okay down there? This is like a tahajjud kind of sujood you're doing. Yeah, okay, take a break. Take a break for a moment. You're going to go back there just now. We're training you for tahajjud, man, so don't worry. We're getting you for qiyamul layl, Ramadan, all that good stuff. Okay, so you're good? Yalla, you ready to do this again? Okay, yalla, bismillah, go ahead. So let me see a good sujood now. Very good. Now the arms, for the men, you want to try to keep it as wide apart as possible. Now the Prophet ﷺ says that it should be wide enough that a small animal could creep underneath here. But in another narration, this is a much more accurate narration in terms of creating the image of the sujood, is that the Prophet ﷺ, his companions said that we could see the whiteness of his armpit. So once that's accomplished, then that's the wideness of the arms and how they should be in the sujood. Otherwise, this looks pretty good. What do you guys think? Looks pretty good? So this is pretty much how the sujood, inshallah, should look. Are you okay down there? Yeah? Is there anything you want to say to anyone? Whilst you're in sujood? You want to make dua or something? Okay, yallah, jazakallahu khairan. You can go back now. Okay. So I hope, inshallah, that kind of at least helps a little bit of how the sujood should look. For the sisters, remember we have a section where we will talk about the 5 different ways, and I will go through all the fiqh rulings as well, inshallah, of how a woman prays different from a man, especially from how she folds her hands, how she goes into the ruku, and everything in the sujood and so on. We will talk about that once that section arises. Let's continue. From the akhta, or the mistakes of the sujood. This is rare, but it does happen. And it is a misconception that a lot of people have with the sujood. And that is that some of the imams perform a sajda to sahu, or that apologetic sajda, or the sajda of forgetfulness. Some imams perform this when they have the gut instinct, that feeling inside of them that there are non-righteous people praying behind them. So where's this all coming from? It was narrated by some of the companions that the Prophet ﷺ prayed Salat al-Fajr one day, and he read Surah al-Rum. When the Salah was over, what happened is that the Prophet ﷺ turned around to the companions and said that there are still people amongst us who do not perfect their wudu. And as a result, it has caused me to become confused when I recite. So what did some imams take this narration and do with it? Basically, when an imam now, some imams, when they recite and they're leading salah, and if they make a mistake in the recitation, then the first thing they do is they turn around and say, it's your fault, because there's some non-righteous people in the jama'ah, and you guys caused me to make a mistake. First and foremost, this hadith is da'if. It is a weak hadith because of a particular person by the name of Shabib or Ibn Na'im. Ibn Na'im, the scholars, scholars of hadith say, we don't know how just and how fair and honest this individual is. And obviously for a hadith to be sahih or hadith to be hasan, those two categories, you need somebody that has justness and has the reputation of being fair, honest, and trustworthy amongst the people. It's not enough to just say, look, I'm a trustworthy person. You have to have that reputation amongst the community as well. So because of this individual who is part of this narration, scholars did not accept this narration. Next mistake. The next series of mistakes have to do with the sitting position and the tashahud of prayer. Now, the first one is saying Assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabi wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So sending salat and salam to the Prophet ﷺ is not the mistake itself, it's how it's done. Now, the Arab-speaking brothers and sisters, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But for the rest of us, let's look at this very carefully. If you say Assalamu alayka, what this entails is that you're talking to someone who's in front of you. In other words, they are alive and there. And scholars, they had an issue with this because when the Prophet ﷺ was alive, he ordered the companions to send peace and blessings to him in the prayer. As a matter of fact, there were a couple of instances where some companions only praised Allah, but they didn't send peace and blessings to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ was made aware of that, and he told them to repeat the salah and go and do this. So the question here is, What is the issue that scholars had? Ibn Hajar says, and I quote, "It has been narrated by a series of narrations of the method of how the salat and the salam to the Prophet ﷺ should be done. What has been ordered during his lifetime is that they would say Assalamu alayka, using the kaf in that word alayka. Now that entails that somebody is alive and in front of you and well. But this here is not permitted now because the Prophet ﷺ, of course, is not with us anymore. So what should we say instead? What should be said is you use the extension. In Arabic we call this the damir. You use the extension or the pronoun that suits the position and circumstance of the Prophet ﷺ, which obviously is not here with us anymore. So you will say, Assalamu ala nabi wa rahmatullahi. You will say, wassalatu wassalam ala nabi. So you will now omit or erase alayk. Everybody with me so far? Shake your head if you're with me. Okay, good, alhamdulillah. I think most of us here are with me so far. So this is the quote of Ibn Hajar, and also this is the quote of the majority of ulama. And by the way, Ibn Hajar states this quote in his explanation in Fathul Bari, which is the explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari. Now this is a linguistic technicality of the salah. You have to at least pay attention to a little bit of the Arabic language to understand where this is coming from. But again, it's a crucial point, and it's part of the perfection of the salah itself. The next khata or mistake when it comes to the sitting position. Now the sitting position, let's just talk about this very briefly, is how do you send salat and salam to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Because why? Some people, when they say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim and so on, and they continue and they add a lot of extras to this dua. There's only two ways that have authentic narrations of how you send salat and salam to the Prophet ﷺ in his prayer. Here's the first one, so just listen to it carefully and see if this sounds like what you're probably saying in your salat at this moment. The Prophet ﷺ mentions, this is the first way it should be done. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. So that's the first way. Listen to the second way that has an authentic narration to it. اللهم صل على محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وبارك على محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. So two narrations. Both of these can be found in that little dua book, The Fortification of a Muslim, or Husn al-Muslim. That dua book has both of these narrations in them as well. Otherwise, what the ulama, especially scholars of hadith, state, everything aside from these two manners. Now, scholars of hadith, as one brother was telling me, scholars of hadith are like scholars that feed you an entire platter of food. Whereas other scholars, they'll just give you bits and pieces. They'll give you snacks here and there. I thought this was really interesting because whenever you're dealing with scholars of hadith, they give you everything. They'll give you the hadith, they'll give you the authenticity of the hadith, where you can find it, and how that hadith became sahih or daif, so you get the entire platter right in front of you. Whereas other scholars, they will say, this hadith is sahih and leave you there. Or they'll say it's narrated in Bukhari. There's nothing wrong with that. They're just scholars of hadith, subhanAllah. They're in a completely different category from everyone else. So these two narrations here, Of course, as I mentioned to you, are authentic narrations that you can find them in all the authentic hadith books, including Bukhari, Muslim, and all the Sunan books as well. Next mistake that we want to look at, because there's really not much to discuss when it comes to the sitting position. There's really nothing much that we need to discuss. But when it comes to the sitting position, the next mistake is the manner or the method of how the sitting is done. Now, there's a number of ways of how you can sit. So this one here, let's get my volunteer really quickly. So we're just going to sit. This time you're going to face towards this direction, okay? So now pretend you're sitting like you're just about to finish Salah. So you're just going to, you're going to about to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, right? Okay, so face the Qibla completely. Okay. So here, what we're looking at is a couple of things. Number one is his arms. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it came to his arms, he would try to avoid touching them on his legs as much as possible. There is one narration, by the way, where scholars have a difference of opinion of how authentic this narration is. Where the Prophet ﷺ, Shaykh al-Albani says this hadith is sahih, where this left hand is almost touching the left leg. So turn around now. Let's let everybody see what we're doing. So this left hand is almost touching the leg, but this right hand is still mustaqim. It's still straight up, no issues here. So this is one method that you can use, or the second method is both arms are straight. Next issue when it comes to the tashahud is where the actual hands are placed. There are two ways that can be done. Both of them, inshallah, are correct. I found good evidences for both of them. Imam al-Nawawi mentions in his Majmu' both of them. Whereas the hands, they can be placed right over the knees itself, or they can be placed above the knee itself. So you have this method, or you have this method as well. So either or, inshallah, are good. When it comes to the tashahud, talk about that in a moment. Next thing is that we want to look at is the feet. So now you're going to turn around, face the Qibla, turn around the other way. Is the position of the feet and how it should look. So the brother here has got the idea so far. Try to get all of your toes facing the Qibla. Not just the first few, all of them. No, just on the right feet. So sit on your left feet. Good, perfect. That's how you want your tashahud to look. You don't want just a couple of the toes. You want to maximize every moment. You want Allah Azza wa Jal to reward you for everything you're doing in the salah. You see how simple these things are. This is just our own carelessness that we're losing reward in our salah for the simplest little things. So this is the first thing that you want to make sure you do. This is not easy. So if you're able to do it, by all means, if not, at the best of your ability. You want to make sure that your back is straight as well. And that's how the tashahud or the sitting position should look like. Okay? I'm going to call on you maybe one more time. Okay? Very good. So that's the tashahud and how it should look. Just one more detail that we want to talk about. It's part of a lot of customs, if you'd like, that there is no salat and no salam to the Prophet ﷺ in the first tashahud, right? So after you finish 2 rak'ats, say praying dhuhr, after the 2 rak'ats, you're just saying at-tahiyatu lillahi was-salawat wa-tayyibat all the way. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And then you stand up for the 3rd rak'ah. This here, according to some scholars, is a khata. It's a mistake of the salah. Because the Prophet ﷺ ordered that every single tashahud, it should have a salat and salam to the Prophet ﷺ. So part of perfecting the salah. Now, just so you know, scholars differ on this. Because there is another narration of the Prophet ﷺ that he allowed some of the companions to just say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and stand up for the 3rd rak'ah. So scholars differ on this issue because the Prophet ﷺ seems to be as though he's allowed both of these methods to happen. So here what I will say to you is very simple. the author here also encourages this as well. And that is, you want to try to make sure that we perfect our salah and maximize all the reward as much as possible. So when you say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and you want to stand up for the third rak'ah, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. That is the minimum of the salat and the salam to the Prophet ﷺ. Do at least the minimum and go into the third rak'ah. Especially if you have the opportunity to do that. If you don't have the opportunity, of course, in the prayer behind an imam, then the first is sufficient enough. Next mistake, this is one of the last mistakes, or last couple mistakes, is the raising of the fingers in the prayer, in the tashahud, of course. Now, we've discussed this in one of our fiqh discussions, that there are basically three main ways of how this should be done. So you can refer to that video, but I'll just go through it very briefly just for the sake of our discussion. The first method that the ulama tell us of how to use this index finger in tashahud is, number one, is that the tashahud finger is always facing the qibla from the beginning of tashahud until the end, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's just facing the qibla all the time. Number two, the tashahud finger is starting off. The beginning of the tashahud, the finger is facing the qibla. But after you say, wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and you start making dua, then your finger starts to bounce. Okay, it starts to do this tapping effect. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned that this tapping effect here is equivalent to taking a hammer and beating the shaitan over his head. So this is actually, it's sort of like a supernatural benefit. It's very powerful in and of itself. So this is the second way. And then this is only done during du'as. So du'as for the Prophet ﷺ and your own personal du'as as well, you're doing this. The third method is also a common one. Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah also mentions this in his book, where you shake the finger throughout the entire tashahud, from beginning to end. Wallahi, brothers and sisters, just based on my own level in doing the research for this, Allah Azza wa Jal knows best, but they seem to be all correct. All of them seem to be authentic. And what I found even is that when I look at Ibn Taymiyyah's discussion about this, I find that Ibn Taymiyyah also doesn't really make a big deal out of it. He basically says that all of these are maqbool and they're accepted, you know. So he doesn't really make a major issue out of it. So with that in mind, it's really not a major issue even with us when we do it in the salah. But we try to formalize it at least so that we have those options and we try to utilize them as best as we can. Then the last thing that I want to say for our next discussion is the du'as that are recommended for the tashahud period. As the Prophet ﷺ mentions that just before you say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, before you say the taslim, this is time when du'a is accepted by Allah Azza wa Jal. And Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah mentions that the du'a that's encouraged during that time is du'a for your parents. So you start to make a lot of dua for your parents just before you're about to finish the prayer. It's also a crucial time. And then we'll talk about the different types of salams that conclude a prayer as well, how it should be done. So if you say the salam, who should you be looking at? Should you be staring at the wall, staring at the ground, staring at your shoulder like this? What should you do? Then there's some mistakes regarding this. Some people, when they say the salam, they close their eyes. I don't know for what. I'm still trying to find like at least some history behind it. But I don't know. I haven't found anything about it. But I've noticed this, and we want to talk a little bit about that as well. And that will conclude the sitting position of the tashahud, and that will take us in, of course, to the mistakes in a masjid and the salah in jama'ah. So this, of course, we're going to talk about the mistakes in the adhan and in the iqamah, in the takbir, with all the jama'ah together. How do we say Allahu Akbar as a jama'ah? And then we'll also talk about some of the rewards in the jama'ah and some of the people's mistakes regarding certain practices in the jama'ah. Some people, like for example, standing feet to feet. You ever notice that you'll go to some masjid, there's this wide gap between you and that person? but then you'll go to another masjid and that person is cutting off your blood circulation. So where do you find a gap, and what's the fiqh ruling behind all of this? So all of those things, inshallah, we will look at bi'awnillahi ta'ala. So having said that, this will happen on Sunday. So brothers and sisters, Sunday, inshallah, after Maghrib, we will meet here. We didn't get a chance to meet last week Sunday because there was a volunteer dinner from the conference happening upstairs. So that's why we didn't have a halaqah then. But we will have a halaqah, inshallah, this Sunday after Maghrib. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to increase us in ilm, increase us in knowledge and wisdom, and cause us to understand our religion, and cause us to be close and have a strong relationship with the Quran and the Sunnah, and implement it in our lives each and every single day. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. I'll just spend like a 5 or 10 minutes and we'll just take a couple questions, inshallah.